Tonight we're not chasing kings or conquests. We're not talking about swords, empires, or the fall of mighty dynasties. No. Tonight we open the cupboard. Because sometimes history doesn't hide in battlefields. Sometimes it hides in bread that cracks like bones. In sauces that once reeked of rotting fish. In meals that fed revolutions and nightmares alike. So take a deep breath, loosen your shoulders, let your hands rest. This is not a lecture, this is not a documentary. This is a quiet unraveling of food that should never have existed, and yet did. Over the next hour we'll take you through two meals from American history. One that nearly broke soldiers' teeth, and one that fooled the entire nation. You don't need to take notes. Just get comfortable. Maybe close your eyes. Let the sounds sink in, and let your mind drift through a pantry, filled with ghosts. Tonight we begin with a sound that haunted two armies and cracked more than just teeth. Not gunfire, not drums, but the unmistakable crunch of something that should not have crunched. Hardtack, a biscuit so dense, so stubbornly dry, that soldiers in the American Civil War swore it could stop bullets, break molars, and perhaps, if you threw it hard enough, change the outcome of a skirmish. But despite its complete refusal to resemble food, hardtack became the silent companion of hundreds of thousands of men. Union, Confederate, North, South. They disagreed on almost everything except this. Hardtack was awful, yet it kept showing up, tucked into haversacks, floating in thin stew, knocked on the edge of a table to chase out the bugs. Sometimes used to patch a tent when rations ran low and imagination ran high. It was cheap. It was filling. It lasted forever, literally. Some pieces of Civil War hardtack still exist today, preserved in glass cases, looking suspiciously fresher than most gas station sandwiches, and when you see it up close, you understand the horror. Flat, square, pocked with holes like a checkerboard, color of despair. No sugar, no butter, no mercy, just flour, water, and a little too much time. They called it sheet iron. They joked it could stop cannonballs. They dunked it in coffee, whiskey, rainwater, anything to soften it enough to avoid an emergency visit to the camp medic. But this wasn't just food. This was survival pressed into a square. A thing you chewed not for taste, but for proof you were still alive. And night after night, as campfires flickered across muddy fields, and boots rested beside dying embers, somewhere, someone was gnawing on a piece of hardtack, imagining his mother's bread and the softness of a world long gone. So tonight, as we lie in warm beds with soft pillows and too many snacks within reach, let's take a gentle, curious walk through the crumbly history of the most unchewable icon of American warfare. It's dry, it's ancient, and somehow it still speaks. So, what exactly was this mysterious, jaw-shattering square? Hardtack, not a nickname, not a slang term, a name as blunt as the food itself. Hard, because biting into it felt like arguing with a rock. Tack, because the texture landed somewhere between roofing nail and punishment. In its simplest form, hardtack was just three things: flour, water, and time. No yeast, no oil, no love. It was rolled flat, poked with holes to prevent puffing, and baked, sometimes twice, until every molecule of joy had evaporated. Then it was cooled, packed, forgotten, rediscovered, packed again. By the time it reached soldiers on the front lines, it had already aged more than the drummer boy carrying it. It didn't mold, it didn't soften, it didn't expire. It just existed, like a biscuit-shaped ghost of nutrition. Some said hardtack was baked months before it was shipped. Others swore theirs had been around since the Mexican-American War. And a few believed, perhaps not wrongly, that they were eating the same batch that fed George Washington. And yet, in a strange way, that was the point. Hardtack was designed for shelf life, not pleasure. In an era before refrigeration and plastic wrap, it was a miracle of logistics. You could toss a crate of it on a wagon, drag it through 2 rainstorms, a battlefield, and 3 bored mules, and still, open it up and find it perfectly intact and completely inedible. But that was its charm. This was the food of armies, not feasts, not families, but tired, hungry, mud-covered men who didn't need a meal to inspire poetry, just one that wouldn't rot. You didn't eat hardtack because you wanted to. You ate it because it was there, because the commissary said so, because it was either that or licking your boots for salt. And so it became more than just food. It became a ritual, a test of will, a badge of honor, a bonding experience shared by both Union and Confederate soldiers alike, standing around the fire, tapping their rations against rocks, hoping to crack them open like oysters, laughing through clenched jaws and loose teeth. In the end, hardtack wasn't about taste. It was about endurance, theirs and yours. So the next time you nibble a cracker and complain it's stale, remember, there once was a biscuit that could survive the apocalypse. And it came with your name on it, stamped right into the cardboard crust, waiting to be soaked, scraped, and maybe, just maybe, swallowed. The morning comes quietly in camp, not with birdsong, not with sunshine, but with the stiff ache of another night spent on dirt, a fire reduced to embers, and the dull anticipation of one predictable thing. Breakfast. You sit up slowly, boots already half frozen, uniform damp from the dew, and stomach rumbling with low expectations. There's no smell of bacon, no eggs crackling in a pan, just the faint, chalky scent of flour, dusted over everything like disappointment. You reach into your sack, fingers brushing past a crumpled letter, a bent spoon, and then, there it is, the same square of regret from yesterday. Hardtack, still hard, still intact, still quietly mocking you from your palm. You tap it against your canteen. It echoes. You try biting it. Your teeth reconsider their loyalty. You squint, looking for bugs, and you're rewarded with a tiny, wiggling surprise. Breakfast just got crunchy. But you've done this before. You know the drill. Step 1. Bang the biscuit against your boot heel to loosen any unwanted protein. Step 2. Dunk it into your tin mug of weak, gritty coffee. Step 3. Wait. 30 seconds? 1 minute? 10? No one really knows. Some say wait until the biscuit gives. Others say wait until you do. You take a bite. It doesn't crunch so much as resist. There's a chew, then a sudden collapse, and your mouth fills with the sensation of damp flour, moldy wood, and the memory of better times. You chew in silence. So does the man next to you. No one talks during hardtack. It's not a social meal. It's a shared burden. A quiet contract between misery and maintenance. Someone across the fire grumbles, "Mine's still got a nail in it." Someone else shrugs, "More iron for your blood." Another breaks his in half, offering the cleaner side to a friend. Brotherhood, it seems, can be built on broken biscuits. This is breakfast, and no matter how many battles you've fought, how many miles you've marched, how many nights you've shivered in the open air, this hard, joyless square will be waiting for you every morning like a bitter ritual. And yet, there's something oddly comforting in its constancy. No matter the chaos of war, the hunger, the homesickness, hardtack is always there, unchanging, unapologetic, unmoved. You finish your biscuit. It takes a while. You're not full, but you're functioning. You rinse your mouth, swallow some coffee grounds, and look up at the rising sun with the kind of blank hope only soldiers can muster. Breakfast is over, and regret has a slightly floury aftertaste. Some food is meant to expire. Milk curdles, fruit bruises, bread molds. But hardtack waits. It doesn't spoil. It doesn't soften. It doesn't age. It simply endures. And not just for weeks, not even months. We're talking decades, generations, lifetimes. There are pieces of Civil War hardtack still around today, sitting in museums, framed behind glass, labeled, catalogued, preserved. Though to be fair, preserving hardtack is like preserving a brick. You don't need to try very hard. In fact, at the Museum of the American Civil War in Richmond, Virginia, there's a piece of hardtack over 160 years old, still square, still hole-punched, still ready to break the jaw of any brave soul foolish enough to challenge it. It's a kind of food that doesn't decay. It just waits for another war. Soldiers back then joked that some biscuits had been left over from the Revolutionary War. Some believed they were eating the very same rations issued to Andrew Jackson. One diary claimed a piece had a date stamp from 1832, although by then it was more fossil than flour. But this wasn't an accident. Hardtack was designed for this kind of absurd longevity. Bakers produced it in mass quantities, stacked in wooden crates, and shipped it across miles of rough terrain, knowing full well it might not be eaten for months. Sometimes it was made and stored in arsenals for years before a conflict even started. Imagine baking a meal for someone and knowing they won't eat it until 5 presidents from now. The durability of hardtack came from its simplicity: no yeast to spoil, no fat to turn rancid, no milk or sugar to attract mold. Just flour, water, and an oven's unforgiving embrace. And then, dry it again. And if you're feeling cautious, dry it one more time, just to make sure hope doesn't survive in the middle. Hardtack became so synonymous with permanence that soldiers started using it for everything. They carved it into playing cards, filed it into dice, wrote letters on it, seriously. One piece from the war was mailed home with a message scratched into its surface, postage attached, and successfully delivered. You can't do that with a donut. But perhaps the strangest part is this. When the war ended, some veterans kept their hardtack, not as food, but as memory, wrapped in cloth, placed in drawers, pulled out decades later to show grandchildren what survival looked like in 1863. A biscuit that outlasted bullets and peace treaties, a relic of struggle with a crunch that echoed across time. Some tried to eat it again. They usually regretted it. But there it was, still here, still whole. A monument to what food becomes when taste no longer matters, and only function survives. And somewhere, in a dusty museum or forgotten attic, it's still waiting. Not to be eaten, just to be understood. There are skills you pick up in war. How to march, how to fire a musket, how to make a blanket double as a raincoat, a pillow, and occasionally a tent. And then there was how to eat hardtack without needing dentures by 30. Because, make no mistake, this was a combat skill. One not taught by generals but passed between weary soldiers like folk wisdom. The culinary equivalent of disarming a landmine. The first step: inspect your biscuit. Is it cracked? Good. Are there weevils? Even better, you won't be alone. Is it solid with no visible give? You may want to update your will. If the hardtack passes inspection, and even if it doesn't, the next move is softening. Because you don't bite hardtack, you negotiate with it. The most common tactic? Dunk it. Into coffee, into soup, into hot water, muddy puddles, or whatever was nearby and vaguely liquid. Some even dipped it in whiskey because if it didn't soften, at least you wouldn't care anymore. There was no exact science. Some said wait 2 minutes. Others said soak it until it stops resisting. One corporal reportedly left his biscuit in a pot for 3 days before attempting a bite. And still it put up a fight. Others tried a more aggressive approach, hammering it with the butt of a rifle, sawing it with a bayonet, stabbing it with a fork like it owed them money. If all else failed, you'd hold the biscuit near the campfire, not to toast it, but to warm the edges, hoping the heat would coax it into submission. Some men invented hardtack hash, smashing the biscuit into crumbs, mixing it with beef fat and onions, then frying the mixture until it resembled something slightly less discouraging. A rare few actually boiled hardtack into porridge. Hardtack stew, if you can imagine such a thing, where the main ingredient is despair, and the seasoning is salt from your own tears. But even then, there were rules. Never bite into hardtack with your front teeth. That's a rookie mistake. You'll lose a tooth, a friend, and possibly the will to live. Always use your molars, the back teeth, the grinders, the ones evolution gave you for roots and tree bark and whatever this is. And if, after all your efforts, it still won't yield? Some men simply use the biscuit as a plate. Eat your beans on top of it. Let them soak through. Then, when the hardtack has absorbed the flavor, the heat, and just a touch of moisture from the universe, you take a bite. It's still awful, but it doesn't actively wound you anymore. And in the trenches of 1864, that was a win. So yes, eating hardtack was an art form, an act of patience, a calculated risk. And every time a soldier took a bite and didn't chip a tooth, it was a small victory. Not just over the biscuit, but over the cold, the hunger, the war itself. Because if you can survive breakfast, maybe you can survive anything. There are things you expect in a biscuit. Flour, a bit of malt, maybe a hint of butter. You don't expect it to move. And yet, for Civil War soldiers, biting into hardtack was a gamble. Not just for their teeth, but for their sanity. Because hardtack, for all its geological strength and wartime reliability, had one fatal flaw. It was a 5-star hotel for bugs. Weevils, mealworms, beetles, larvae of mysterious origin, tiny, determined, hungry, and very much alive. They didn't just infest the hardtack, they thrived in it. By the time that biscuit reached your mess tin, it had likely hosted more life than the nearest creek. Some soldiers gave them names, others gave up entirely. There was even a nickname, worm castles. Because after months of sitting in humid barrels, packed in crates, stacked in arsenals, and carted across muddy fields, these biscuits didn't just contain bugs. They were built by them. Open a crate and you might see flour moving. Lift a piece and it might wiggle. Tap it and watch the tiny residents scatter like they knew what was coming. So how did soldiers cope? First, they'd knock the biscuit against something solid. Helmet, boot, rock, not to soften it, but to evict whatever was living inside. Some would hold their hardtack over the fire. Just enough heat to make the bugs wriggle out or roast inside. Then you'd brush the surface, blow on it, maybe say a quick prayer, and dig in. But here's the wild part. Most didn't throw it away. They just ate it. Because when you're marching 30 miles a day, soaked in sweat and cannon smoke, hungry and half awake, a little extra protein doesn't sound so bad. In fact, many joked about it. One Union soldier wrote in his diary, "The worms give it a kind of meatiness." Another quipped, "If the weevils beat me to the biscuit, I call it fair ration sharing." And perhaps the darkest humor of all came from Confederate camps, where rations were so scarce that a bug-infested biscuit was seen as a blessing. Twice the calories, half the complaints. Still, not everyone took it so lightly. Some refused to eat hardtack unless they could boil it first, watching as a thin, oily film rose to the surface of the pot. Others simply held it at arm's length, sighed, and bit down anyway. Because war doesn't wait for fresh bread, and hunger makes philosophers of us all. So next time you swat a fly away from your lunch, remember the men who shared theirs, who stared down a biscuit crawling with life and thought, could be worse, and then ate it, crunch included. It wasn't soft, it wasn't sweet, but somehow, hardtack found its way into the hearts of soldiers. Not by flavor, but by memory. You see, in a world where everything could be taken in an instant, your health, your horse, your best friend, hardtack stayed, unchanged, unyielding, like a stubborn promise. And that made it perfect for something unexpected, a keepsake. Long before smartphones and selfies, soldiers had to get creative. No flowers to press, no photos to frame. So what did they send home? A biscuit, stamped with a date, scratched with a name, wrapped in cloth, kissed with dust, and tucked into the corner of a letter. Sometimes they carved initials into it, sometimes they drew little hearts, and sometimes they wrote whole messages, yes, entire letters, written on the biscuit itself, scrawled in pencil or carved with a pin, a soldier's words etched into the unforgiving crust. To my dearest Mary, still alive, still marching. This fed me yesterday. May it never feed you. One biscuit, sent by a Union private, arrived in Massachusetts with the address written directly on the hardtack, a makeshift postcard postmarked in sorrow and starch. Another was mailed with this note: "This cracker lasted longer than my boots. Hope it lasts long enough to reach your hands." And reach them it did. Many women kept these biscuits for decades, tucked in trunks, pressed into Bibles, wrapped in handkerchiefs that once held tears. To others they seemed like curiosities, strange, cold tokens of war. But to the women who received them, they were more than flour and salt. They were proof that he was still breathing, still thinking of her, still holding on. Some even replied, "I pray this biscuit is the last one you eat in battle. Come home and let me bake you real bread." And in that we glimpse something soft, something tender, beneath the hardest biscuit in the world. A promise of return, a hunger not just for food, but for touch, for home, for hope. These artifacts still exist. You can find them in dusty museum corners or estate auctions. Their corners worn, their messages faded, but their presence unmistakable. The biscuit that never broke and somehow held a heart together. So yes, it fed soldiers, but it also carried their love. Because in a world where so much was destroyed, sometimes the only thing left to send was a biscuit that wouldn't die. And a few words carved into its chest. Most food rots, some melts, a few go stale. But hardtack, it endures. It sat in barrels for months. It traveled on wagons through rivers, over battlefields. It survived the damp, the rats, the mold, and the mouths of desperate men. And somehow, it's still here. Across America you'll find them. In glass cases, under museum lights, surrounded by fragments of uniforms, rusted bayonets, faded letters. And right there, in the middle of it all, a single, unbroken biscuit. Some look almost new. Round edges, faint markings, still hard as ever. One sits in the Smithsonian, another in Gettysburg. A third was discovered in a family attic, wrapped in linen, next to a locket and a tooth. They've been carbon dated, analyzed, catalogued. Historians marvel at their preservation, not because of special materials or storage conditions, but because hardtack refuses to die. No mold, no rot, no decay. One curator joked, "If the apocalypse comes, I'm raiding the hardtack exhibit." Another called it America's least appetizing time capsule. And yet it's beloved. Why? Because it's real, tangible. The Civil War left us paintings, stories, and sepia-toned photographs. But this you can hold in your hand. It doesn't just tell a story, it is the story. Some are inscribed. Dates, names, units. Others bear tooth marks. Yes, tooth marks, still visible like fossils of forgotten hunger. One even has a bullet lodged in it. How? No one knows. But the idea that a biscuit could stop a bullet became legend. The immortal bread became a metaphor for endurance, for resilience, for how something so bland, so unwanted, so overlooked, could outlast cannonballs, presidents, and even memory. Children on school trips press their noses to the glass. They giggle. They cringe. Teachers say, "Imagine eating that every day." But deep down, there's awe. Because this little cracker, this rock-hard relic, was there. It fed the weary. It held their messages. It witnessed a nation at war with itself. And now, it rests in silence. No longer chewed. No longer cursed, just remembered. Because some things fade. But hardtack? It waits. Every food has an ending. But hardtack never really got one. Because when something refuses to rot, it also refuses to be forgotten. After the war, soldiers returned home, some broken, some whole. But all of them carried a memory that was oddly edible. And around campfires, bar stools, and veterans' halls, those memories turned into legends. Some said hardtack saved their life, blocking a bullet, absorbing dysentery, or simply giving them something to chew when the world was falling apart. Others swore it ruined their teeth forever. "Cracked one molar," one old vet claimed. "Cost me more than the war ever did." Then there were the jokes. Was hardtack food, or was it weaponry? Could you skip it across a river? Use it to hammer a tent peg? Shore up a leaking boat? One popular tale claimed a soldier lost a game of poker and had to eat 3 pieces of unsoaked hardtack, dry, with no water. He made it through 2. The third one broke him. Not his will, his jaw. Of course, not all stories were true, but truth didn't matter, because every vet had a hardtack story, and those stories became part of their identity. Some brought pieces to reunions, displayed them like medals, held them up during speeches. This, my friends, was my breakfast for 6 months, and I'm still bitter about it. Even the younger generation got in on it. Kids would dare each other to take a bite, to chew what Grandpa once called God's least favorite invention. One man, a Civil War reenactor, kept a real piece of 1860s hardtack in his pocket at every event. Not to eat, just to remember. Because for all the jokes, the truth was simple. It meant survival. Even if it tasted like furniture and chewed like concrete, it showed up, day after day, ration after ration, and somehow so did they. So what is the legacy of hardtack? Is it the recipe? Flour? Water? Salt? No, it's what it represented. The boredom, the hunger, the bitterness, and the brutal, bizarre humor that helped men get through it all. It was tasteless but unforgettable. It was unwanted but unyielding. It was a paradox, much like war itself. And maybe, just maybe, that's why some veterans kept a piece until the day they died. Not for the flavor, not for nostalgia, but because it reminded them they made it. So now, as we dim the lanterns and brush away the last crumbs of memory, we leave behind the biscuit that wouldn't break. Not because it was beloved, but because it refused to disappear. In a war that consumed nearly everything, it lingered. Not sweet, not soft, but stubborn, like the men who chewed it, choked on it, and somehow kept going. Hardtack never wanted to be remembered. But history has a habit of keeping the worst-tasting things close, and maybe that's the point. Not every legacy is grand. Not every relic is golden. Sometimes the story that survives is the one that chipped your tooth. So, let's set it gently aside, back into its box, back into its glass case, back into the corner of the war it never left. And just as you begin to drift, you wonder, was there ever anything else this ridiculous? Anything else we once trusted as food, but had no right being on a dinner plate? The answer, dear listener, is yes. And it comes in a bottle, slippery, salty, familiar now, but once terribly misunderstood. Ketchup, but not the red stuff you're picturing. No tomatoes, no sweetness, no fries on the side. Just fermented fish guts, left in barrels, under colonial sun. Yes, before ketchup found tomatoes, it found something much, much worse. So, if you're still awake, lean back, close your eyes if you like. Because next, we're sailing back to the colonial kitchens of America, to a sauce that smelled like rot, tasted like revenge, and somehow became a national treasure. This is the story of ketchup. Before tomatoes, before the ketchup bottle, before the fries, before the red, there was fermented fish. Yes, the thing in your fridge, sweet, smooth, comforting ketchup, used to be brown, funky, and almost liquid. You may think you know ketchup. You might have it every day. But the ketchup of old, you've never met it. And trust me, it's better that way. Let's drift back centuries ago, not to America, but to a steamy port in Southeast Asia, a place of sails, spices, and strange barrels left under the sun. Inside those barrels, ruot ka. Intestines, bones, skin, left to rot, salted, sealed, forgotten. Months later, when someone finally pried one open, they didn't scream. They dipped a finger in, tasted it, and said, "Not bad." This was ketchup, a briny sauce from Fujian, China, used to flavor rice, fish, and anything too bland to eat alone. It spread quickly to Vietnam, to Malaysia, and eventually to curious European sailors. They didn't understand it, but they loved it, so they brought it home and tried to make it without the climate, without the ingredients, without the knowledge. What came out was wrong, but they kept the name, ketchup. Now imagine a colonial American kitchen, wooden spoons, boiling pots, and a strange smell filling the air. Not cinnamon, not stew, but something darker, pungent, almost fishy. A housewife stirs a thick black liquid. She's following a recipe: salt, anchovies, walnuts, sometimes even mushrooms or oysters. This was ketchup. No tomatoes, no sugar, no red. Just umami, centuries before the word existed. And it was prized, used sparingly, stored carefully, shared at dinners to impress neighbors or gross out rivals. But here's the thing. Most people couldn't make it right. It spoiled easily. It fermented too far, or not enough. One wrong step, and instead of flavor, you got poison. Yet they kept trying, because the taste was addictive. The name sounded exotic. And in a world where boiled meat and boiled cabbage were considered meals, a spoonful of ketchup could change everything. So the question becomes, why did we ever decide to change it? And how did this strange, brown, fish-based sauce become the sweet red companion of French fries and backyard grills? That, dear listener, is a story of cultural confusion, accidental innovation, and culinary redemption. And we'll get there. But for now, as your eyes get heavy and the scent of fermented anchovies lingers in your imagination, just remember, your ketchup has a past, one it doesn't want you to know. And it all started without a single tomato. So you've just learned that ketchup began its strange life without a tomato in sight. But if you thought that was odd, wait until you hear what was inside it. Because before ketchup became a cheerful red squirt on your burger, it was something else, something ancient, something odorous, something alive. To understand it, you'll have to leave the tidy colonial kitchens for a moment and drift further east, back to the warm, wet shores of Southeast Asia, where salt was gold, and fish, especially the parts no one wanted, were everywhere. The people of the region had a secret. They knew how to rot fish just right. It wasn't magic, it was fermentation. They packed fish guts, heads, bones, sometimes the whole fish, into large clay jars, added generous amounts of salt, sealed them tight, and let time do the rest. Weeks passed, sometimes months, even a year, and when the lids were lifted, the result wasn't fish anymore. Not exactly. It was liquid, dark brown, savory, sharp, salty, mysteriously meaty. And it smelled like, well, let's just say your nose might protest before your tongue gives in. This was ketchup, the ancient precursor to ketchup, a fermented fish sauce used to transform bland food into something worth eating. The technique wasn't new. Romans had their version, garum. The Vietnamese still have nuoc mam. The Thai have nam pla. Ketchup was just another expression of the same truth. Rot things carefully, and they reward you. It was culinary alchemy. Now picture this. A Dutch or English sailor, docked in Indonesia, eats a local meal. Rice, maybe dried meat. But it's the sauce that grabs him. He doesn't understand it. He can't name it. But he wants it. So he fills a bottle, takes it back across oceans, and shows it off at home. There's just one problem. Nobody back home knows how to make it. So they guess. They swap fish for anchovies, throw in vinegar, try mushrooms, even use walnuts and lemon peels. They don't get it quite right. But they keep the name, ketchup. Each batch was an experiment. Each cook, a mad scientist. Sometimes it worked. Other times the bottles exploded. No, really. Fermentation is alive. If you don't stop it at the right time, gases build up. Pressure increases. And one day, your shelf of condiments becomes a war zone. And yet, people persisted. Because something about that deep, funky umami flavor called to them. Especially in places where winter made food dull and meat had to be preserved for months. A spoon of early ketchup brought life back to the meal. It was a punch of salt, sour, depth. A reminder of far-off lands, of spice, of discovery. Even if it smelled a little like a harbor at low tide. But soon this culinary bravery would be tested. Because colonial kitchens were messy places. And this sauce? It didn't age well in the wrong hands. Next, we enter those kitchens, to meet the brave souls who tried to recreate ketchup from scratch, and often made something worse. Much worse. Spoiled barrels, soured stomachs, and one man's ketchup that may have ended his dinner party. Permanently. So settle in, close your eyes, and steel your gut. The next course is a catastrophe. By the time ketchup reached the colonial Americas, it had already been twisted, diluted, and reinvented by European hands. What began as a potent fermented fish sauce from Asia, dark, salty, mysterious, had become a culinary puzzle. The English, in particular, took to it with experimental fervor, replacing tropical ingredients with what they had on hand. Anchovies, mushrooms, even walnuts and oysters. Each household seemed to have its own version, some sour, some bitter, many entirely inedible. But the idea of ketchup was intoxicating, an exotic import, a touch of the unfamiliar in a land of salt pork and stale bread. Across the ocean, in the wood-smoked kitchens of the American colonies, settlers began making their own batches. Recipes passed through letters, scrawled in journals, whispered between neighbors at market stalls. The ingredients varied wildly, but one thing stayed the same: no tomatoes. Instead, these early ketchups were dark brown, watery or thick, fermented or vinegar-based, and always risky. Because in an age before refrigeration or standardized canning, every bottle of homemade ketchup was a ticking time bomb. Colonial Americans, eager to impress at dinner, would pour their ketchup into glass bottles sealed with wax or cork. The lucky ones served something flavorful. The unlucky ones served something alive. In many cases, these ketchups continued to ferment long after bottling. If the seal was too tight, pressure built up. Pop! The bottle burst. Splatters on the ceiling, the walls, the guests. Sometimes, worse than embarrassment, came illness. Spoiled batches brought on sour stomachs, headaches, and in rare cases, more serious consequences. Still, the trend spread. ketchup became a staple at colonial tables, not as a sweet sauce, but as a kind of culinary dare. Its presence suggested worldliness, sophistication, and a willingness to endure a little danger in pursuit of flavor. Housewives and cooks alike obsessed over perfecting their recipe, writing to relatives in London for advice. Try the mushroom base, ashushice, one might suggest. Add brandy to preserve it, another would whisper. But consistency was elusive. What worked in one climate failed in another. What pleased one family disgusted their guests. And so, ketchup in colonial America became a kind of cultural virus. It infected homes, dinner parties, and kitchens. It bred fiercely loyal fans and deeply scarred skeptics. It was a taste that traveled not by ships, but by stories, by trial, error, and stubborn pride. And yet, no one had quite figured it out. No one had asked the simplest question: what if we just added tomatoes? That revelation wouldn't come for some time. For now, American ketchup remained a chaotic concoction, an ambitious sauce without an anchor. And as it bubbled in its bottles, sometimes silent, sometimes explosive, it waited for someone to finally give it a red identity. But before that moment, it would claim a few more victims. Because next, we step into the kitchens where dreams of ketchup turn to disaster, where spoiled barrels met polite society, and ambition met its digestive match. It's one thing to misread a recipe. It's another to nearly poison your guests with it. In colonial America, ketchup was often both a culinary experiment and a silent threat, lurking quietly in glass bottles or wooden barrels, looking entirely innocent, until it wasn't. You see, without modern sanitation, refrigeration, or any understanding of foodborne bacteria, making ketchup was like trying to bottle the ocean with your eyes closed. And worse yet, people insisted on making it in bulk. Huge batches, sometimes stored for months in the root cellar, growing richer in flavor, or more often in fungi. Imagine a dinner party in 1760. Candles lit, stewed meats on pewter plates. A proud host, eager to impress, brings out a bottle of his homemade ketchup. He uncorks it with a flourish. There's a hiss, maybe even a soft pop. A few guests glance nervously at each other. The smell is assertive, earthy, sharp. One brave soul spoons some onto a slice of boiled beef. Another follows suit, dabbing a little on their potatoes. Conversation continues, until it doesn't. Within an hour, the table has thinned. A guest excuses herself. Another clutches his stomach. The proud host now wears a shade of pale that not even candlelight can soften. What was supposed to elevate the meal has, instead, ended it early. By the next day, half the party is bedbound. Some blame the meat. Others suspect the wine. But one person knows the truth. It was the ketchup. Stories like this weren't uncommon. Diaries and letters from the era are peppered with subtle references to ill-fated condiments or strange sauces that turned on us. There were whispers of bottles that exploded in hot weather, barrels that bubbled long after they were sealed, and sauces that went black with mold before the label was even dry. Still, the allure persisted. Ketchup represented something exotic, an edible souvenir from distant lands, a mark of modernity in a world that still chopped wood to boil water. And so, the cycle continued. People made it. People served it. People regretted it. There were those who tried to fix the problem by boiling their ketchup longer, adding more salt or brandy to preserve it, or even burying the bottles in cool earth. These tricks sometimes worked, but only sometimes. More often they just delayed the inevitable. In the end, early ketchup was less of a recipe and more of a gamble. It didn't come with instructions. It didn't offer second chances. It was a wild thing, tamed only briefly before turning on its maker. But despite its unpredictable nature, ketchup remained a fixture, part condiment, part cautionary tale. And while it claimed many victims along the way, it also inspired something else. A desire to do better. A hope that this dark, strange sauce could be improved, refined, and perhaps one day, even enjoyed. That moment was still to come. But before ketchup could become the star of the American table, it had to take one more strange detour. A shift in ingredient. A leap of logic. A bright red twist no one saw coming. Because someone, somewhere, finally asked the question, what if we added tomatoes? For decades, ketchup had wandered the colonial culinary landscape like a misplaced ghost. Brown, sour, misunderstood, and occasionally dangerous. And then, somewhere in the early 1800s, a shift happened. It wasn't loud. There were no public debates or grand culinary declarations. But slowly, quietly, something red crept into the recipe. Something plump, juicy, suspiciously normal. The tomato. At first it wasn't taken seriously. In fact, tomatoes had a rough reputation. In the 1700s, many Europeans believed they were poisonous. Something about the way their acidic juice reacted with pewter plates. There were whispers of sickness, of death, of strange swelling after eating the fruit. Some called them love apples, but not with affection. More like curiosity or caution. But in America, where culinary traditions were still young and fearless, tomatoes began to earn trust. Gardeners planted them, housewives experimented, and then someone, no name survives, but we owe them everything, looked at a pot of strange brown ketchup and thought, what if we just used these instead? It was a quiet revolution, because tomatoes didn't need fermentation. They didn't reek of the docks. They were naturally sweet, naturally bright, naturally thick when cooked down. They brought structure to the sauce. Balance. A kind of logic the old ketchup had never known. They didn't explode in the cellar or curdle in sunlight. They simmered gently on stovetops, filling kitchens with a smell that didn't make guests flinch. The transition wasn't instant. For a while, tomato ketchup existed alongside its odd ancestors. Walnut ketchup, mushroom ketchup, even cucumber ketchup. Cookbooks listed all of them side by side, like siblings with very different lives. But the red one stood out. By the mid-1800s, tomato ketchup had become the preferred version across America. It was served with meat, fish, potatoes, even eggs. Its sweetness softened sharp flavors. Its acidity cut through fat. It didn't try to impress. It simply worked. And people noticed. Suddenly, ketchup wasn't a gamble. It was a guarantee. Families passed down recipes. Entrepreneurs began bottling it for sale. And best of all, no one got sick. No one ran from the table. No one wrote diary entries about a condiment-induced disaster. The sauce had finally found its soul. And yet, even as tomato ketchup rose to fame, something peculiar lingered in its story. A hint of salt, a shadow of fish, a whisper of the chaotic kitchens that came before. Because while tomatoes brought peace to the plate, they couldn't erase the past. Ketchup had been fermented, feral, feared. Now it was tamed, sweetened, and safe. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. And in many ways, the early mess gave the new version its meaning. It was proof that flavor evolves. That food, like people, learns, makes mistakes. And sometimes, after enough barrels have burst and enough stomachs have turned, it finds its way. Tomato ketchup had arrived, and with it, a new era of American taste. But of course, where there's popularity, there's always business. And the next chapter in ketchup's story wouldn't be written in kitchens, but in factories. Because when one man tasted tomato ketchup and saw a nation's appetite, he decided to bottle it for the world. You've seen it before, maybe on an old diner menu, maybe in a vintage commercial. That odd little word, catsup. For a moment it looks wrong, like a typo wearing its best Sunday suit. But once upon a time, that awkward cousin of ketchup wasn't just an alternate spelling. It was a battlefield. The red sauce had finally found its footing in American kitchens. It had tomatoes now, a solid recipe, and the blessing of the public tongue. But just as ketchup was beginning to feel like itself, a war broke out. Not in factories, nor in markets, but in print, in packaging, and in people's pantries. It was a war over a name. Catsup was the old-school spelling, a holdover from earlier British transcriptions of Asian words like ketchup or ketchup, terms for the fermented fish sauces that had inspired the original condiment. When these words made their way west, the spelling varied wildly. There was ketchup, 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 until finally, two contenders remained standing, catsup and ketchup. By the mid-1800s, both names were being used interchangeably in America, sometimes even in the same cookbook. In one kitchen, a bottle labeled catsup might sit beside a pie cooling on the windowsill. In another, ketchup might be stirred lovingly into baked beans. No one seemed entirely sure which was correct. And more importantly, no one wanted to back down. Then came marketing. As tomato ketchup exploded in popularity, companies raced to bottle and brand it. And that's where things got serious. You see, names weren't just labels. They were identity. They were loyalty. And most of all, they were sales. The spelling on your bottle could say everything about your brand. Were you traditional, fancy, folksy, modern? The choice between ketchup and catsup was a statement, not a detail. Heinz, yes, that Heinz, chose ketchup. It was sleeker, cleaner, more American. Catsup, by contrast, started to feel old-fashioned, like calling trousers pantaloons. But other brands doubled down. Del Monte, Hunt's, and a handful of regional companies proudly kept catsup on their bottles well into the 20th century. Some claimed it was more authentic. Others just wanted to stand apart. And so the name war simmered. People debated it around kitchen tables. Newspapers ran opinion pieces. Some shoppers refused to buy anything that didn't say catsup. Others mocked the word entirely. One writer called it a cat's attempt at spelling. Meanwhile, the red sauce didn't care. It sat in its bottles, waiting for fries, burgers, or scrambled eggs, blissfully indifferent to the chaos it inspired. Over time, though, the tide shifted. By the 1980s, ketchup had won, quietly, confidently. Catsup faded into the background like an old jingle no one sings anymore. It still appears now and then, usually for nostalgia or quirk. But the standard has been set. The label is red, the cap is white, and the name, at least in most of the Western world, is ketchup. Yet in that little war of syllables, something peculiar happened. The sauce became more than just food. It became a cultural marker, a symbol of modernity, of marketing power, of how language itself can bend to branding. Ketchup had not only conquered taste, it had conquered vocabulary. But just as the name was being settled, the recipe was about to face its own challenge. Because in the 20th century, ketchup would do something unexpected. It would get sweeter, much, much sweeter.
By the late 1800s, ketchup had finally found its flavor. The tomatoes were in, the fish guts were out, and the naming war was winding down. But one problem still lingered. Ketchup wasn't elegant. It was messy. It spoiled easily. It separated in the jar and, worst of all, it didn't look good on store shelves. That's where Henry John Heinz entered the story. Heinz didn't invent ketchup, but he saw something in it. Potential, purpose, a blank canvas just waiting to be bottled, literally. Born in Pittsburgh, the son of German immigrants, Heinz had grown up with a nose for pickles and a knack for presentation. In 1876, he released his own version of tomato ketchup. It was thick, it was tangy, it was made with fresh ingredients, and, most importantly, it came in a clear glass bottle. Not ceramic, not tin, not wood. Glass. Why? because Heinz wanted people to see what they were buying. In an age of shady preservatives and secret recipes, he offered transparency, literally. You could hold his bottle up to the light and examine its contents. No slime, no bubbling, no strange separation, just bright red consistency, glimmering like rubies in the sunlight. It was a quiet revolution in trust. And Heinz didn't stop there. He redesigned the label, gave it a curved shoulder and a wider base. He embossed the number 57 on the glass, an arbitrary number that sounded like abundance, even though he didn't actually have 57 products at the time. It became part of the brand's mythos, a number that made the ketchup feel official, iconic, eternal. But there was one problem Heinz never fully solved: how to get the ketchup out of the bottle. His glass creation was beautiful, yes, but it was stubborn. The sauce clung to the inside like it was afraid of freedom. People shook it, hit it, tapped it with butter knives. Some gave up entirely and fetched a spoon. It became a running joke, the only condiment that fought back. Still, people loved it. They trusted it. Heinz ketchup became the gold standard. Restaurants switched to it. Diners displayed it proudly on their counters. School children recognized the shape of the bottle before they could even spell the name. It wasn't just a product anymore, it was a piece of American identity. And that identity was clean, controlled, standardized. Heinz kept tight control over every step of the process, from farm to factory to bottle. His ketchup didn't ferment, it didn't rot, it didn't need explanation. It arrived ready, shelf-stable, safe. By the turn of the 20th century, his factories were marvels of sanitary design, bright floors, white uniforms, women workers washing produce by hand. Visitors were invited to tour them, like museums of modern food. The message was clear: this isn't the ketchup of your colonial ancestors. This isn't fish sauce in a wooden barrel. This is the future. And the bottle says so. But behind all that polish and clarity, something else was happening inside the formula. A quiet shift, a slow creep, more sugar, more vinegar, less tomato. Because, in the quest for mass appeal, Heinz had begun sweetening the sauce. And by the mid-1900s, ketchup was no longer just a savory condiment. It had become something else entirely. A red syrup, loved by children, slathered on everything, and sweeter than anyone dared admit. It's strange, isn't it, how something born of fermented fish and colonial confusion could one day end up next to a cheeseburger in a paper tray. But that's the story of ketchup. Not a tale of genius, but of mistakes that kept evolving until they felt right. When Heinz perfected his glass-bottled, tomato-based version of ketchup, he didn't just fix the recipe, he redefined the sauce completely. Gone were the days of anchovies, of vinegar overload, of mystery textures lurking in dark barrels. In their place, smoothness, sweetness, and standardization. And with that transformation came something even bigger: cultural adoption. America didn't just eat Heinz ketchup, it embraced it. It made it a national symbol. It became more than sauce, it became identity. Suddenly no meal felt complete without it. Hot dogs, scrambled eggs, macaroni, meatloaf. If it needed something, the answer was red, sweet, and always there. But most of all, it found its true soulmate: French fries. The crunch of potato met the tang of tomato, and somehow a condiment that once tasted like rotting fish became the perfect companion to fried food. It wasn't logical, it wasn't traditional, but it worked. And in working, it rewrote history. Ketchup was no longer a fringe import. It was American. It left behind its Asian roots. It forgot its colonial detours. And it took on new life in diners, cafeterias, baseball parks, and backyard cookouts. The transformation was complete, not because it returned to authenticity, but because it leaned fully into its reinvention. a mistake so thoroughly reimagined that it became beloved. By mid-century, ketchup had become a non-negotiable presence in American households. Children learned to squeeze the bottle before they could spell it. Parents trusted it to get picky eaters through dinner, and restaurants knew that if the ketchup bottle wasn't on the table, something felt wrong. But in all that sweetness and shine, we lost something. Gone were the sharp, briny notes of anchovy paste, the pungent memory of fermentation, the oddly comforting bitterness of a recipe that once tasted like history. We cleaned it, bottled it, mass-produced it. And in doing so, we buried its strangeness beneath sugar and branding. It worked. Oh, it worked beautifully. But somewhere along the way, we forgot what ketchup really was. We remember the taste on our fries, but not the journey in the barrels. We remember the comfort, but not the chaos it came from. And perhaps, in that forgetting, we lost more than just flavor. And then, it was gone. Not in a loud way, not with a bang. Just a quiet, slipping away. As tomato ketchup took over with its sweetened tang and bottled cheerfulness, the original versions vanished, like chalk drawings in the rain. Children grew up thinking ketchup was always red, always sweet, always from tomatoes. No one questioned why a sauce so iconic was once made from salted fish, spoiled beans, and wild mushrooms. The collective memory folded neatly around the new narrative. More marketable, more palatable, more profitable. Heinz didn't just reinvent ketchup, he reinvented the public memory of ketchup. It was a culinary case of amnesia, a global forgetting, sealed with a pop of a bottle cap. What remained were whispers in old cookbooks, rotting labels in antique apothecaries, and dusty barrels found in shipwrecks. Sauces once so beloved, now misunderstood or mislabeled entirely. Even today in Southeast Asia, you can find fermented sauces still made in the old ways, but they are no longer called ketchup. They've become something else. Fish sauce, soy paste, garum's modern airs, each with their own name, their own place, unlinked in the modern Western mind to the red bottle in the fridge. So if you dip your fries tonight, and that sauce tastes sweet, familiar, tomato bright, remember this, you are not tasting ketchup, you're tasting an imposter. The real ketchup is something you've never truly known, and perhaps never will. And now, the stories have quieted. From the battlefield rations that shattered teeth and softened hearts, to the sauce once fermented in barrels and forgotten by taste buds. We've wandered far tonight through the pantry of American memory. Maybe you've never eaten hardtack. Maybe your ketchup has only ever been red, sweet, and bottled. But some part of you, some quiet corner in your imagination, has now touched the past in a way no recipe ever could. That's the strange magic of history. It doesn't ask to be remembered in full. It waits patiently in crumbs and flavors, in whispers between the things we love and the things we forget. So, if you're still awake, let your thoughts drift, not just through time, but through what might have been left off the plate entirely. And if you feel like sharing, tell me, have you ever eaten something that tasted like a memory? Leave it in the comments. Just a single word, a dish, a scent. Then close your eyes and let the past fade, gently, like the last warmth in a long cold oven. We'll meet again, somewhere between dreams and dinner. Good night.